So good morning to our philosophical community, the White Tower. Today, today's guest is Mindy Mandell. She is now in Japan, and she has a master's degree in international relations from Boston University, USA. For close to 15 years, she worked in various companies in and around Tokyo, teaching English to business people. Her interest in Plato began in the late 1990s, where she met a teacher named Dr. Pierre Grimes. She began studying with him and his group called the Noetic Society. Nowadays, she continues to study with him, always looking to keep growing. She began writing Discovering the Beauty of Wisdom. This is the wonderful book, Discovering the Beauty of Wisdom. And she began writing it in 2016, and it was finally ready for publication in 2020. She has also a YouTube channel all about Platonism, and she began this channel in June 2020. Her aim is to present Plato's works in the holistic spiritual framework that she introduces in her book. So, Mindy, so nice having you here with us today.
Yes, thank you very much for inviting me. It's great to be here.
Discovering the Beauty of Wisdom, embracing mysticism through the ancient path of Greek philosophy.
That's right.
So what does it mean to follow Platonic philosophy as a spiritual path? To take the words of the ancient Platonists seriously and to explore them as a guide for the inner life, as you say.
Exactly. Yes. Yes. It's much more than just catnip for the brain, or, it's more than just a fun thing to toss around. It's through this study, we can better understand who we are, what it means to be human. What is the whole that we are a part of? That's really what this study is. It's a beautiful wisdom tradition. I would say that it's on par with the greatest wisdom traditions of the East. We tend to think of the East, Buddhism and Hinduism, as where you have to go if you want a wisdom tradition. But we have it in our own culture in the West, and it's through the Platonists, through the Greeks.
Great. So I took a closer look at the introduction of your book, where you have about 30 chapters, and they're pretty much categorized into sections, and very careful sections, in the sense that they follow a specific order, starting from the section called Surveying the Landscape as an introduction, then moving on to the Understanding section, and then closing with a Knowing section. So it seems as if you organized your book in a kind of spiritual ascent to the truth, similar to Plato's allegory of the cave.
Exactly. Yes. Yes. For Plato, understanding and knowing have a very special meaning. So for modern readers, we tend to think of understanding as like if somebody explains something to you and you follow what they're saying, you understand it. For Plato, that's closer to opinion, or ideally right opinion. To gain understanding requires turning within you, turning it internally and seeing the growth that comes through that. And so it's a deeper sense. So his idea of understanding is quite different from our modern sense. It's more than just reading the text. We have to really internalize it. because hello. For Plato, and for this tradition, what we really want to do is, well, for him, I should say this first, that learning is nothing more than remembering, he says in his Meno and in a few other places as well. So it's a very different idea of what knowledge is, that we already know truth. In a sense, we can say that what we're really doing is clearing away what is false. That's one way to look at a wisdom tradition, that we're really just clearing away what is false and letting the wisdom that we already are come out. And so by turning our readings inward, by our studies inward, we're questioning ourselves and we're allowing ourselves to look at the beliefs that we currently hold and see if they're in the way, and to clear away whatever is false, to let that wisdom come out. And so that initial stage of turning it inward, that is what he calls understanding. To go from understanding to knowing requires a certain kind of direct experience, which we might call like a spiritual experience, or some call an enlightenment experience. And so it's a deeper level. So we have to, our way of reading initially, as important as that is, and much of that we will continue, we do also have to kind of change gears. And so in the last section of the book, I go into the kinds of practices for the more advanced student.
Great. At this point, I'd like to say hello to Chris, my dear colleague and friend from London.
Nice to meet you.
So, Chris, we were talking about the structure of Mindy's book, Discovering the Beauty of Wisdom. And so, Mindy, I'd like to remind you both of the fact that nowadays people would say, why read a book? And the usual answer that we take back is, I don't have the time, or books are expensive, or I don't know what to read, or I don't know how to read. And can't I just watch a movie instead? Because reading is too hard, actually, for me. Because of the fact that I just never got into the habit of reading. What can we say to all these people that might be interested in reading books, but they don't have the will to do it?
Well, maybe initially you can get some thoughtful ideas by watching YouTube channels such as this one or mine. But eventually, if you really want to penetrate a system like this one, you do have to open the book, and you need to challenge yourself to read just what is on the page, to read exactly what's there and not let your own belief system get in the way of that. You need to challenge it. And so that's the importance of the reading, is that it allows you to go more deeply into the subject and to really, it's part of that process of turning it inward, really, that when we're reading, we often find ourselves skipping over things that are challenging, or if something doesn't agree with the way we think, we tell ourselves, well, that's not what he meant. He must have meant this other thing. Or we add things. He probably meant to say this, and you add something, or you ignore something. If I take this out, then it makes sense to me. But it needs to be there. There's a reason Plato put it there. So if you think that, maybe you're not understanding it as well as you think you are. And so these are all ways that we interpret. And that interpretation is showing us that we're not yet seeing what he's trying to say. And so that's part of that process of clearing away the false and turning things inward and understanding it more deeply. So yeah, there's great value in reading. It really challenges us to go more detailed into the works.
Yeah, really, very well said. And especially the part when you said that reading just what is on the page. And unfortunately, there are a lot of people who bring their worldview and go on with that. It's very difficult to put our worldview aside and see only what is on the page. And it's also quite difficult to learn how to, as you say, how to leave our baggage on the bookshelf by reading critically or intelligently.
Right.
So it's quite an issue of how to approach a book.
Right.
But there are many people who say that you have nothing to gain out of it. And when before we start reading, they say that the author is worthless or stupid, or I don't understand what he or she says, because we often hold false beliefs from childhood onward, and we're used to adopting some conventional notions that sound good on the surface, but these are all false beliefs instilled on us and are highly influential from our society. How can we overturn this situation, and what is this mediatory force we need so as to leverage our understanding and sense of perception?
If I understand your question correctly, I think what you're pointing to is that we have to bring a certain attitude to our reading. If we think that this writer is stupid, obviously we're not going to really put in the effort to understand what this person said. And if we come to it with an attitude of a belligerent attitude, sometimes there's a sort of like an arrogance or belligerence that we bring to the reading, and like, I'm going to show you what's wrong with this guy. That's also going to blow up in our face. It's not going to work well. The example that I gave in the book was reading Einstein. We all know he's a brilliant man. And if we were trying to study his special theory of relativity, we would approach it with an openness. We want to understand this. We know he's brilliant. We know this is a good theory. We want to understand it. And it's that kind of openness that we have to bring. Of course, if you're reading some literature that is wrong, and there are many philosophers out there who I disagree with and I think are wrong, and when you're reading them, when you recognize it, of course, you see that. But I'm talking here specifically about wisdom tradition that, or wisdom literature, such as this literature that is of great value to us, and we have something to gain by reading it and understanding it in this way. So yeah, so initially there's that attitude that we have to bring. Actually, this idea of reading just what is on the page, when I first met Dr. Grimes, this is one of the first lessons that I got from him. He used to say, kind of tongue-in-cheek, that he just teaches people how to read. And of course, he's not talking about sounding out letters in the alphabet and making words as we're reading. He's talking about this idea of not bringing interpretation. And it's a very difficult task. In American high schools, we're often, when we read books in literature class, we're always asked to give our opinions. And so we're reading for the sake of giving our own opinions. But that's really just throwing out our beliefs as we currently hold them. We're not questioning them. We're actually fortifying them by seeing them in the book and putting them in there, even if they're not, really, sometimes. But what we're doing here is putting all that aside. So it's a very different way of reading. And it's quite a challenge for many people, at least when they first come to this practice, to put all of that aside, put all your opinions aside. But you have to understand what the book says before you can decide if you agree with it or not. And so if you're just so quick to throw your own, if you're always thinking about your own opinions, what you already believe, what you already think, how you already see the world, and then you're just going to be trying to shape the literature that you're reading, whether it's Plato or someone else, you're going to be trying to fit it into that framework. And so that's not what we want to do here. We want to put all of our own beliefs aside and just see what exactly is Plato saying. It's a very, at first, it's very difficult. once you get into the swing of it, it's actually quite fun and stimulating.
It's better that way. Certainly, when you should say this man is a scientist, is a writer. He has to say something, and the starting point is always going to be the writer's perspective, and that's the starting point you should adopt at a personal level. And of course, you should read without any judgments, and always having a critical eye. Moving on to your next chapter, the study tools that you have to bring with you. You mentioned some of them, such as analogy, allegory, memorization, pencil yourself in. These are all good ways to work upon your reading skills. And if you are to take all these, let's say, techniques or skills into consideration, wouldn't you say that these are all ways to help us bridge the gap between our physical realm, the world we live in, and the reality hidden behind? In our attempt to bring ourselves closer to the metaphysics.
Exactly. Yes, we want to understand what we are in essence, and it's not the body, it's the soul, and the soul at its core is intellectual. And so we are seeking to ultimately to know ourselves as that. And so we're going through, so the process of understanding is that initial stage of, it's a lot of metaphysics. Sure, we have to read that stuff and challenge ourselves to think about it. But there's also what I wanted to do with this book. Part of the reason I wrote this is because it's more than just metaphysics. Most books about Plato really are just focused on metaphysics. But what I wanted to do here is to help people see how to use the metaphysics to build a study for themselves, to build it's a way of life, really. And how to use this metaphysics to do this process of uprooting our false beliefs and seeing what is true.
And also a lot of people,
the idea of, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. A lot of people might wonder, is it an easy way for people to be involved in such a metaphysical study? People who raised in a culture that places a high value on data and proof, how could they make such a leap into the unknown and the metaphysical world? And how is analogy connected to understanding and the awakening of the soul, as you very well state? How do we puzzle out what the nature of the soul is? I mean, these are all questions that make it more difficult for a reader to get into that perspective.
Right. Yeah, this hunger for proof is a very big hurdle for many people. And I will admit it was a huge hurdle for me. Because that's what we're looking for. That is how we approach education. I think our idea of wisdom is very closely tied to being knowledgeable. We go to university, we read books, we listen to professors, we write papers, we come out knowledgeable, educated. But that's not what Plato's doing. This idea of learning being nothing more than remembering. It's a clearing away. It's not a putting in, it's a taking out. And so we're not going to get proof. I think many people who come to this sort of tradition, maybe they were turned off by Buddhism, by Hinduism, Bhakti Yoga and all of that, the study of love and gratitude, and that turns some people off. If you're more of the intellectual type, you're going to maybe be turned off by that. You want more certitude. And so you think, oh, if I read Plato, I read metaphysics, I'm going to get the understanding behind it. And now I'm going to know, and I'm going to have my answers. And that's a mistake. Unfortunately, it doesn't quite work that way. It's actually, maybe at first it's disappointing that you're not going to get that. But when you do start to see how, when you start to mature the soul, you find that what you actually do get is better than that. It's better than just an answer that you can give somebody quickly and move on. It's not just something you can, write on a piece of paper and you're done. It's something more meaningful. It's something deeper within us, and it plays a very important role. It's a wonderful tool that Plato uses throughout many of his dialogues. And I use the Republic as an example in the book because the whole thing is an extended analogy of the city-state to the soul. And then even within this book, that's an extended analogy, you've got the divided line in book 6, you've got the allegory of the cave in book 7, which are also playing with this idea of analogy. And the reason analogy works so well is because our souls know it. It has, for what Plato recognizes is that analogy is not just a tool. It has an actual reality in and of itself. It's part of the fabric of the unfolding of reality, the realms, and their relationship to one another. It's all analogous, and an analogy runs through it. And so our souls know analogy. And when we work through these puzzles that Plato gives us that are all analogies, it awakens something within the soul. It's the language that the soul speaks. It's like the language of mind that we have to learn. It's like studying a foreign language. Just as when you move to another culture, like I live in Japan now, so I'm learning Japanese. And to learn a foreign language, you know this as well, since English is not your first language, you know that when you learn another language, you're learning another culture, a whole nother way of thinking. And the language of mind is it's an amazing language that everybody knows because it is our native language. It's really everybody's native language. And analogy speaks through that language. So that's one of the main tools.
Yeah,
that
how true. Chris, please, yeah.
Thank you. No, this is very interesting. So it's great to hear this view. We had a discussion on Plato a little while ago in our group. So some points came up there. Accepting all of the very positive lessons and the legacy of Plato that are still relevant and still appealing in the modern world, how do you process or address perhaps some of the very obvious and well-known criticisms of the work of Plato, or the critiques of how his philosophy might be applied, and indeed how he thought that it should be applied in real-world situations, while the allegories and the search for wisdom as internal processes are things that make a lot of sense and can be very liberating intellectually and spiritually. The outcome for him was an approach to the city-state, an approach to hierarchies within society, an approach to different roles for individuals, and a view of people's capacities, which some people interpret as being very elitist and rather rigorously limiting of people's potential and expectation. So as both a student, a fan, and let's say a campaigner for the benefits of Platonism, how do you address those concerns and criticisms? You know, some of them are recent, but some of them were around even in his day.
Sure. Yeah. Actually, I would say that I probably read Plato quite differently from those critics. Okay. Because Plato made it clear in the second book, when he set up this analogy of the city-state to the soul, that he was only setting up the city-state in a way that would allow him to show what he wants to show about the soul, which means that the city-state, as he's setting it up, is not actually something that he sees as an ideal. The goal, as I see it, is to see how he sets up the city-state, the various, you talked about there being different statuses and so on throughout the society. When you see how that is lined up and how it lines up, for example, to the tripartite soul, then you're seeing something about the soul. The real focus, I think, is on the soul. I don't really think that he was advocating this society. Like, for example, book 5 in the Republic talks about like separating children from their parents and things that most people just find kind of crazy. I don't really think he was advocating that. I think what he was doing is challenging us really to ask ourselves what would result if we imagined this imaginary city. And when you do that, everybody around you, you don't know who your birth parents are. So everybody is, depending on their age, they're like a sibling or a parent or a grandparent or a child to you. You're going to treat everybody like family. And so you create one whole. And whether you think that's an ideal or not, you can ask yourself, what would happen to the soul? If that's the condition he's setting up in his imaginary city state, that's just an analogy. The real focus is the soul. What condition is he creating in the soul? Oh, everything is functioning as one whole. And then what would result from that? And so I think that's the real focus. And so for me, those sorts of critiques, I don't really take them terribly seriously because I don't think that that's what Plato was actually doing with the dialogue.
Okay. Do you think that this interpretation, which is in effect taking all of those comments as analogies, as building blocks to a kind of introspective process, does that apply to the representations of his metaphysics in terms of, let's say, the role of the gods, the position of the Greek pantheon within his work as well? Or do you think that it would be more accurate to assume that he was considering these were actual entities, actual forces, spiritual forces with their own personalities and names as per the myths that have come down through history?
I would say that mythology is personifications of divine functions. And so seeing how he uses the gods in his dialogues is showing something about how he sees these divine functions functioning. And so the gods, for example, they are all tied to real being. And each one has, every time there's a different function being discussed, a different god is named. And so you're seeing how they are functioning. And in the highest level, they are the gods, but then it unfolds into the eidos and then through the various realms that participate in them. And so we're looking at how they function in that way. I don't think that Plato took the gods literally as like when you read mythology, you know, the gods are all jealous of each other and they're fighting each other and so on. He actually says in the second book of the Republic that this is no good, that we can't teach this. That's the idea of censorship. He wasn't truly advocating censorship. He was saying we have to cut these literal readings of mythology out and better understand what is being pointed to with these stories.
Thank you. That's very interesting.
Yeah, actually, it is. It's better to hold a question than make a judgment. After all,
yes,
it is much better to stay confused and remain open to answers answers which are not convenient, but bring us closer toward wisdom and towards the metaphysical realm. And moving on to the chapter 14, turning the soul, as you very well state, in chapter 14, you present a number of studies that Plato included in his dialogue Republic, such as arithmetic, geometry, solid geometry, astronomy. Somebody could ask, for example, what all these sciences try to say, and what is their role in Plato's work, and how does Plato present them?
Well, again, this is part of the analogy of the city-state to the soul, because this is in the Republic. And so that's why he gives them names like arithmetic and geometry and astronomy and so on. But what he's really doing is you open it up, and as you sort of tear down the analogy and break it down, you realize that what he's actually giving us are metaphysical contemplations. For example, arithmetic, he gives the example of when you pick up 3 fingers, your ring finger is taller than your pinky, but it's shorter than your middle finger. So it's both tall and short. We can put 2 words on it, but we're only seeing one thing, one finger. And so that causes the soul to question what is true. And eventually, as we look around and as we tear down this study of arithmetic, as we see how he's presenting it, what we see he's doing here is he's saying that everything has to have unity in order to exist, right? Our bodies, the microphone I'm talking into, the computer that I'm looking at right now, everything has to have unity in order to exist, right? My book, if I were to tear it apart, take off the binding, it would just be a bunch of scattered pages. It wouldn't be a book anymore. So you take away the unity, you take away the existence as that thing, right? And unity presupposes one. There has to be one in order for there to be unity. And so one is the condition for all that is. And that anyone who has studied even a little bit of Platonic metaphysics knows that the one itself is the first principle of all and the condition of all. But Plato doesn't want us to just take his word for it. He wants us to experience it for ourselves. And so that's what this contemplation is. And again, this is one of his studies of bringing understanding to the soul, of turning it inward. It's one thing to just think about it, to hear this explanation and say, okay, I follow that. That's opinion, that's right opinion, but it's not understanding. Understanding comes by turning it inward. And so all of these studies really are like koans. Like in Buddhism, they have the koans. Like a student asks a teacher, does a dog have Buddha nature? And the teacher says, moo. And so one of the most famous koans is, what is moo? And people just contemplate this for years. Well, that's the same idea that we're doing here, only instead of contemplating what is moo, or what is the sound of one hand clapping or something like this, we're contemplating things such as, what is one? He asks the question in his explanation of arithmetic, what after all is the one itself, or one in itself? Not one thing, but one as the condition for all that is. And this is a metaphysical question that we're not going to answer with logic. We can get some sort of answer, but we're not really going to penetrate the question until we turn it inward like a koan. And that's what all of these studies are. These are Plato's studies for turning the soul.
So all in all, through this study of numbers, which are the symbols for the divine order, we could consider numbers as the doorway into the realm of our mind and spirituality, as you very well state, and thus have a harmony of both the beautiful and the good, as you say in your book.
Harmony.
This is again Mindy Mandell's book, Discovering the Beauty of Wisdom, Embracing Mysticism Through the Ancient Path of Greek Philosophy. This philosophy of the Platonic tradition, we're very happy for this interview. Mindy, I don't know if you'd like to say a final comment.
Before you do, Mindy, can you also tell us where people can find you if they're interested in your work? Where are the best places on social media or other internet locations where people can look you up or find more about you or interact in any way?
Oh, yes, thank you very much. Yes, I'm on YouTube. I have a channel called All About Platonism. And there I have many videos that go through Plato's dialogues and also the metaphysics behind the dialogues. And also there's a reading group where we're actually right now we're reading the Republic. And so I invite everybody to check that out as well.
And your book is available, I guess, at Amazon
Yes.
and all good booksellers.
Absolutely, yes. And it's through the Prometheus Trust, which is a British publishing house.
Okay.
And if you go to their homepage, then also you can find it there.
Thank you so very much for sharing today.
So, Mindy, we hope to see you again in our next interview in the near
Yes,
future.
absolutely. Yes, it's been a lot of fun. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you too.